In the beginning, there was nothing. Then there was like an explosion or something, and 2016 years or so later, there was Overwatch. Since that explosion, there's always been competition between different life forms for dominance, and since the beginning of Overwatch, there have been tournaments. From Apex to E-League, contenders to ESL, one has always been at the forefront: the World Cup. In 2016, the first Overwatch World Cup was hosted, and it looked absolutely nothing like what it does today. There were 6 invited teams, and 10 that came through a series of qualifier tournaments. The invited teams had a mix of streamers and professional players. Their rosters are pretty funny, with some recognizable names like Seagull, Surefour, and Linkser, players who would have a long-lasting legacy in the game, and Muselk, Pokelols, Stir, and my personal favorite, Logan the Best. Not all of these teams were messing around, however, as Brazil and Korea had some pretty serious teams. People who are new to the game, or who aren't nerds like me, might not remember how good Sirmajed was, but this guy was truly a talent at the game. South Korea had so many great players to choose from that no matter who was on their roster, they were probably going to win, but they chose half of Lunatic Hai and a mix of players from other top Apex teams. Eska, Ryujehong, and Miro were truly dominant players, and I wonder what would have happened if Eska had kept playing. 4 of these players would end up on the Seoul Dynasty, and all of them would end up in the Overwatch League in some role. In the early days of Overwatch, many professional players from other games joined the scene to represent their org as they expanded into the game. One of these players was Dyrus, who was actually a reporter of this event, although he would never take professional Overwatch seriously. Others include Rafa, who played on Team Liquid while also being one of the greatest Quake players of all time. The talent gap in this event was pretty large, and many of the teams that got in through the qualifier would go winless in their groups. Canada and Brazil, 2 invited teams, were both eliminated from the pool, and Australia, with probably the most unserious roster of them all, was also eliminated. Although the Thai team was eliminated, one of their players, Mickey, would show his skill at the game, and this would lead to him having great success in Overwatch. Now, however, he is jacked and travels the world. What a life. Other stand-up performers were Shadowburn of Russia for his Genji, Harryhook for his uncanny ability to be a Lucio one-trick, but play exclusively Soldier 76 during the World Cup and look like the greatest player in the world, and the entire Korean team for going on a tear and not losing a single map throughout the entire tournament. In the final bracket, the talent gap was truly on display, as the only matches that looked close were France versus Russia, with Russia winning 2-1, and Spain versus Finland, with Finland also taking the series 2-1. Korea and Russia would face off in the finals after defeating the other teams handily, and South Korea would dismantle the Russians with a 4-0 blowout. Sweden took 3rd place in a close match with Finland, with the GOAT Tavik leading the way. Every team would take home a huge $18,000. The tournament was not as serious as those to come, but it showed that there was real hype around the game and its competitive scene. It was clear that this was a place for unknown players to prove themselves, and show that they were worth signing, and for established players to flex their muscles and represent their country. It also showed the gargantuan skill gap between South Korea and literally everyone else, as they went undefeated through the whole tournament. I remember that people were saying that South Korea would be winning with Wiimotes in a few years, because there was a Mariana Trench of skill between them and even the 2nd place team. Next year, however, things would be different. To start, this year's format was much different. This would be the first year where players could show off the Overwatch League teams and potentially change the course of their careers. There were no teams that were automatically invited to BlizzCon, as that only promoted them to not take it seriously and invite players like Logan the Best. There were 4 LAN qualifiers in Santa Monica, Shanghai, Sydney, and Katowice. The teams at these events were really random, as somehow France ended up playing in Shanghai, China. But nevertheless, these events were ridiculously hyped. Speaking of the Shanghai qualifier, this was not a close contest, as both France and China went undefeated and moved on to BlizzCon. This was a huge coming out party for China, as Leaugue was able to display his immense talent for the first time on the world stage alongside Eileen and other players who would go on to be on the 0-40 Shanghai Dragons. They showed the world how good the team Miraculous Youngster was. They were a huge deal back in the day, as they were beating the top Korean contenders teams as a fully Chinese roster, which was a heavily underrepresented region in the early days of Overwatch. In a lot of ways, the World Cup showed the world that China was a serious region and showed us their most talented players. It was not without drama, as 4 players were replaced due to visa issues. But without those issues, we probably would have never heard about the future Overwatch League MVP Leave, so I guess it all worked out. For France, this was the continued dominance of Team Rogue, who were one of the greatest teams of the pre-Overwatch League era. They basically created Dive, with their 1-tank, 3 DPS comp dominating all non-Korean competition. Eventually, Rogue would break up due to Overwatch League teams not wanting to pay their crazy buyout rates, but they were a really special group. The Sydney qualifier was a little more eventful. Sweden and Australia would emerge from this group, but Japan and Spain won their side of the bracket. Japan was very close to defeating Australia and qualifying with outstanding performances from AKTM, who unfortunately would not go on to have a very successful career in Overwatch, and Tayo, who would go on to join the San Francisco Shock a few years down the line. Australia beat them 3-2, with their team representing Blank Esports. The best Australian player at the time, and the only one in Overwatch League, Custa, did not participate this year, but Trill was a great player who would go on to join the Dallas Fuel, and Gunba, who would go on to coach the Florida Mayhem to their 2023 Overwatch League championship. Team Sweden was made up of Misfits Gaming and would eventually become the core of the McDonald's color scheme Florida Mayhem. They also had the king of Reinforce, but he would be replaced by Snillo, who was actually an excellent player before he went into the forests of Sweden to harvest mushrooms. That isn't a joke.
Okay, so for Season 2 of Overwatch League, when I got to the team house, I asked where Snillo was, because he wasn't there. And I was told they couldn't contact him for like 4 months during the entire off-season. And when he finally shows up, he said he was living in the forest in Sweden with his grandmother, foresting in the woods for mushrooms. And was
Katowice qualifier wasn't as close, as Canada and Korea would come out. These teams were very good, as XQC would make his World Cup debut alongside Agilities and Mangachu, who would put up legendary performances and cement themselves as great players. The Korean team was ridiculous, but the best player was actually Flower, who was dominating on Widowmaker with a broken arm. And he was only 17, playing alongside the married man meta himself, Sabiolbi, who would tilt the rapist Sinatra exponentially in this event.
He's good, but he's not like a insane 1v1 chaser. It's just mad annoying.
Xiao, Mistakes, and Sharik were great for Team Russia, and I love this Dutch team, but I don't think anyone cares. Sharik would have the funniest Overwatch League career out of all of these players, however, as he played for like 2 months for the Toronto Defiant and was not good. The Santa Monica qualifier was great, as the USA and UK would emerge. Team Belgium would show the talents of Logix and Spree to the world, both of whom would have long Overwatch League careers, with Logix being pretty successful. Team Brazil looked actually decent for the first time, as their star player was Lico this year. EQO and Cafe would make their returns for Team Israel. Cafe was a great ranked player, and EQO was a great Overwatch League player with a long career. Signed was a DPS player from New Zealand who was a pretty hyped prospect that unfortunately retired before he was of age to play in the Overwatch League. For Team Taiwan, I want to talk about the absolute dominance of this guy Zonda. He was a truly special player. He didn't have a long Overwatch career, but he now plays professional Apex Legends and played a league before coming to Overwatch. I wish him the best. Bacon Jack was good too. I feel bad for not having it as in-depth of an explanation, but he would have a successful career as well. The whole UK team was good this year, and I remember Mikey A was a notorious trash talker who was just okay. Cruz was a great player who I remember watching learn Korean on YouTube, and he was a DPS player at this point in his career, but he changed to be a support player later on as he joined the Overwatch League for the Paris Eternal. I will say that he was much better as a DPS. Christopher was a great player before being a coach, and Smex was excellent, but they were outshined by the boys in blue, the Americans, because simply we have more freedom. This was the world debut of Jake, and he showed out, dominating against Team Germany and making a name for himself as a trash talker and competitor. He didn't play Junkrat, although I still fear that at any moment he may be waiting behind me with a ripped tire to end my life. Fact Fiction and Cool Matt made a great tank duo, but Matt was known for losing his mech on D.Va and was praised for that somehow. Early Overwatch was really weird. This was also the debut of Roxas' Fat Behind on the world stage. On to BlizzCon, the UK would face off against Sweden, Canada would play Australia, France would play China, and controversially, Korea would play the US. People thought this was rigged for some reason, but there was no point in rigging this. Sweden dominated the UK to the point where nothing important happened at all. Canada would narrowly defeat Australia in a reverse sweep, led by XQC and Agilities. France defeated China in a closer contest in the score reflex, and soon AKM and Nico GDH, my namesake, showed their special connection as a DPS tandem. In the final match, Korea defeated the US in a closer match than last year. This was the second time Korea eliminated the US, and it was clear that a rivalry was brewing. These players did not like each other. In the Sweden and Canada match, Canada would once again squeak out a victory in a very close match. Korea would then defeat Canada, leading to a Canada versus Korea final. This was not really the expected result, but people were happy with it, as the most popular Overwatch player ever, XQC, was in the grand finals. That being said, this match was not close, but XQC would take home the MVP trophy to much fanfare.
I'm feeling great. I didn't expect this at all. He's lying. I didn't expect that.
Sweden would take home third place over France, and a successful World Cup was done with. South Korea's dominance, players from all over the globe showing off their skill sets, and drama would all continue into this year's World Cup. Once again, there were LAN qualifiers in Incheon, LA, Bangkok, and Paris, and the location where teams played actually kind of made sense this year, aside from Team Finland playing in Incheon. This was the first year where there was no playoff in the group stage, meaning that the two teams with the best record from the group would advance to BlizzCon. Every single game mattered, putting the level of competition this year at an all-time high. Also, this was the first year where teams were allowed to have 7 players on their team, allowing them to mix and match Overwatch League players with top-tier contenders players and those who were hungry to prove themselves. The matches were played with the same format of early Overwatch League, where at least 4 games were played no matter what, meaning that some games had a 4-0 score and others had a 3-1 score because the last map they played was just for seeding. At the Incheon qualifier, we would see Team Hong Kong lose every single map in this very competitive group. Mango J was their star player, and he would be a big part of Talon Esports, the team that had a stranglehold on contenders in the Overwatch League era. For Team Taiwan, in their first year without my King Zonda, they got 5th place, led by A-Ting, who would be a member of the Chengdu Hunters in 2020, alongside former Team Taiwan player Bacon Jack, who did not play in this tournament because he was actually retired. He unretired almost immediately after the tournament to join the new expansion team Chengdu Hunters. Team Japan was made up of the contenders team Cyclops Athlete Gaming, as Tayo was once again their star player, but it wasn't enough to qualify for BlizzCon. Team Russia would remain mostly unchanged, as they had their staples of Xiao, Shadowburn, and Mistakes. But this would be the last World Cup for Mistakes as a player, as he retired after a solid year with the Boston Uprising, where he replaced a man who will not be mentioned. He was a huge part of their undefeated 10-0 stage, which was a pretty huge deal at the time, especially with all the drama. The second place team who would go to BlizzCon was once again Team Finland. They had a very successful group, as they only lost to South Korea in a very close game, pushing them to the brink for the first time in history. Davin joined as the only contenders player, coming from the legendary Team Giganti, which many Finnish Overwatch legends called home at one point or another. Bigus and Shaz were the team support duo coming from the LA Gladiators, where they made a name for themselves as reliably great players. Linkser and Time have reunited to show the world their combined powers at DPS duo. This was a unique team in that players came from all sorts of different teams, with Fraggy coming from Philly and Zappis from Mayhem, where he was probably the only good player besides Tavik. Finally, in first place was South Korea, but this was definitely the weakest team they fielded so far. They played a weird style with Wrecking Ball, who was just released at the time of the event. He had a glitch with his kit, where his slam would deal more damage depending on how many people were around him, but Fate, their tank, was not able to use his ability very well, because, to put it simply, he was ass the new character. Speaking of Fate, he was the only player from the LA Valiant who would go on to win Stage 3 of the inaugural season of the Overwatch League, led by himself, Custa, and Agilities. Besides him, Carpe would come from Philly, where he was among the 3 best players in the league, Jonak, and basically anybody else from NYXL made up the rest of the roster. NYXL was the best team in the league, and it was a no-brainer to just take their roster. It was clear that this year, South Korea had taken their foot off the gas a little bit, and just assumed that they could show up and win. But in reality, other teams took this event very seriously, and scrimmed a lot to help players get used to playing with each other. Fury, Fleta, and Animo would come in for BlizzCon due to visa issues, and this was a massive improvement for the team, and they moved on to BlizzCon as huge favorites to take it home once again. The LA qualifier was notably less competitive. Team Switzerland would be the fall guy this time, losing every match, led by Helv, who had reclassified from Spanish to Swiss 2 or 3 times in his long playing career. Team Austria made sure they weren't too lonely at the bottom though, giving them 2 maps in their competition. Their best player was Mini-Me, who is best known for his time on Clockwork Vendetta, who were a very strange but successful European contenders team. Team Norway was 4th place, and they had some very solid players like Onigod, who played in the league for Dallas Fuel. He was a very highly touted prospect who would underwhelm, probably because he changed the name to Spectral, which was a terrible name compared to Onigod. He did hit one of the sickest clips of all time though. I mean, this is just ridiculous. A human being should not be doing stuff like this. This is just like, oh my god. Decod was a tank player coming from last night's leftovers, which would go on to become the core of the Atlanta Reigns Academy team, except for Decod, but he was still very solid. IPN would round out the roster, but he has had much more success as an Apex Legends player and streamer than an Overwatch. Team Brazil would finally get some wins this year, with their best player, Alamo, being the only Brazilian player to ever play in the Overwatch League for the Boston Uprising. Canada would be 2nd place, losing to the Red, White, and Blue. Their team remained pretty much the same this year, despite XUC no longer being in the Overwatch League, and pretty much abandoning the competitive scene to focus on streaming, which ended up working out pretty well for himself, as he now makes more money per year than LeBron James for streaming on Kick. They were coached by the inventor of esports, Jane.
52 seconds ago, esports is the future, but it's not going to invent itself. Jane is going to invent eSport!
Who was most known as a streamer, but was also a solid coach for the Dallas Fuel, and was involved in the organization of Team Envy for a while. For the champions of the group, the US of A. This was the best team we had fielded up to this point, with a mix of great players, most notably Moth and Hydration, who would make their World Cup debuts. I believe that Dante was snubbed this year, as Zachary would take his spot, coming from the greatest contenders team of all time, Fusion University. Out of the Bangkok qualifier, this was definitely the group of death, with 4 teams being ranked in the top 10, and China being at the #1 seed, even over South Korea. Spain would fall flat with their worst roster so far, probably because Harry Hook actually played support this year instead of his usual Soldier 76. For the host country Thailand, this was an underwhelming showing, but a very young player called Patty Pan would make his World Cup debut at only the age of 15. He would quit Overwatch to go play Valorant for a while, but would then come back a few years ago to play for the Gladiators, where he would show off his raw talent and actually impress in his showing, before retiring again. Tito Watt would also impress on Tank, and this event would help his career, as he later played for the Uprising Academy. If you look at pretty much any player on Liquipedia, they have probably played for the Uprising Academy at some point. Places 4 through 2 would all be tied with a 3-2 record. Sweden would miss BlizzCon for the first time, as Reinforced was once again their tank, but this year it was clear that he was outclassed, as he did not play competitive Overwatch at all at this point. Sharp would make his Overwatch World Cup debut, and he would be a hyped up Overwatch League prospect as well, where he would eventually play for the Atlanta, Reign, and Dallas Fuel, but underwhelmed. Pretty much every hyped prospect from Scandinavia failed in the league besides Kevster. My Danish Kings would field a special roster this year, with Naga and Fisher creating a devious DPS duo and Ding impressing on support. Shax is one of the few established players in this group, and he would have a long career playing for the Valiant and Spitfire. Australia would get second place, led by Custa and Punk, who would have long careers of their own. Punk was a big surprise and formed a 1-2 punch with Custa that would help to lead this team to BlizzCon. China was able to remain undefeated after close matches with Denmark and Australia, where they were able to win 3-2. This was a true coming out party for Leaugue, as he showed how underrated he was, despite still being too young for the Overwatch League. The league requiring players to be over 18 destroyed the talent pool in the early days. It's crazy. Shai would also dominate in his debut alongside Yveltal, who would both eventually join the Overwatch League, playing with the Hangzhou Spark. The real story of the event, however, is Guzhui, as he demonstrated his prowess on Winston, deadlifting Team China in their win over Denmark. He was the first player to truly master Primal Rage and set the standard for what it meant to be a truly great Winston player after players like Miro were shown to be kind of fraudulent in the league. He would have a long and prosperous Overwatch career playing with the Hangzhou Spark, showing that this performance was not a fluke by any means. The Paris qualifier was not as eventful. Poland went winless, led by Danye, who played for the Paris Eternal for a little bit. I say played, but he did a lot of benchwarming. Italy got a big win, led by my personal friend, Dragon Eddie. If you want to know a little more about that story, you should watch my last video. And while you're at it, you should also leave a like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. It's free and it only takes a sec. Germany once again made no noise, but their flex support player Kodak was very good and played for the Atlanta Reign and coached after his playing career. This was the first year without Internet Hulk, who sadly passed away the year before. Netherlands weren't able to make a splash this year despite having a pretty good team, including Brusson, who played for the Uprising. This was their first year without DPS duo Mort and Too Easy, but they were replaced by Yona and Vasility, where Vasility especially would impress with his flex DPS play. The UK qualified with a very similar team to last year, but Fusions would replace Christopher for BlizzCon. KSP, or Kai as he's now known, and Kib would make their debut, creating a deadly duo of 3-letter name players. Kib had a very interesting Overwatch League career, where he was involved in a rare trade that sent him from the Guangzhou Charge, where he was one of their original members, to the Philly Fusion for Fraggy. The first season Charge team was very interesting, but that's a subject for another video. Team France finished in first place in this group, undefeated largely in part to the Paris crowd, who cheered "Soon" every time a big play happened. This is one of the first times in Overwatch esports where the crowd was actually engaged, and it's a big reason why there was ever a league team in Paris. The team stayed largely the same, losing Nox, who retired, to add Poco and Benbest, while retaining most of their rogue core. Wins was a controversial selection, as he never moved on to Overwatch League and was focusing on Quake, but he was selected to the team over players like Dredro because he is AKM's brother. Still a legend of the game though, as he could often be seen in professional matches tweeting as he pushed the payload while the rest of his team beat everyone for him. Then we moved on to BlizzCon, where the US would face off against the UK. Australia played South Korea, China played Finland, and Canada played France. These matches would not be very close though, as the UK would beat the US 3-1, although we will never forget that you guys blew a 13 colony lead. Korea defeated Australia 3-0, China defeated Finland 3-0, and Canada defeated France 3-0. Korea defeated the UK in a close match, where the UK drew 2 maps and kept the rest of the series pretty close, with Fusions kind of exposing Fate a little bit. China beat up Canada 3-0, where Guzhui definitely exposed XQC. The third place match was pretty intense, and this was way closer than any other playoff match, as Canada barely beat the UK, finally getting revenge for having to have the Queen on their money. In the first place match, Korea beat up China really badly, 4-0, and Jonak took home the MVP of the tournament, making for a nice year for him, as he would also take home the Overwatch League's first MVP trophy. Korea did not lose a single map in the playoffs this year, and kept their undefeated streak, coming up with their first three-peat like a young Michael Jordan. But this would all change in This year's format will once again change, and I believe this was a major reason that esports events fail, especially ones that exist in a similar fashion year over year. The format of the NBA or the NFL will never change. They may add some more games or a mid-season tournament, but they don't relegate the worst team in the league or anything. That's the reason why EVO is successful, as they keep mostly the same games every year, a similar format. Whatever. Anyway, this year had some preliminary tournaments to decide who would go on to play on the group stage. The group stage would decide who went to the playoffs at BlizzCon. A few teams dropped out of the tournament, including Brazil and Thailand, but I want to use this opportunity to talk about the most important team, of course, Team Argentina, who had Klaus, a great player who made waves in his short Overwatch career playing with, you already know it, the Uprising Academy. He is now a successful Valorant player for Crew Esports. If Team Bulgaria didn't drop out, Vega would have been the youngest player in this event, being the only player younger than me. He would have been 13 at the time and played alongside Bogart. Vega is currently attending university and is better at Overwatch than me. It really makes me think that I'm worthless. Anyway, Group A of the preliminaries had Denmark and Australia as the heavy hitters, where Australia would barely defeat New Zealand in their oceanic rivalry, and Denmark defeated Taiwan. Up was a star player for Australia this year, and he was a great Tracer player who did not have a very long career. Custa did not play this year, and Face and Unter, who would later become coaches, filled the support slots instead. Team Denmark looked a little different, with Molfig stepping in on tank. He was a pretty solid player and played for a long time in European contenders. My Danish brothers would win this group and move on to the group stage. The UK dominated Group B, with the same roster as last year minus Mikey A, who was replaced by Funny Astro. Team Iceland was interesting as they had two Overwatch League players, Finzi and Happycool, who'd have short and uneventful careers, but hey, at least they made it there. It's funny that Iceland is such a small country, but sent 2 players to the Overwatch League. Group C saw a little more competition, especially between Italy and Japan. Italy won 3-2 against a familiar Japanese squad, but they would eventually fall to the new look Team Sweden, led by childhood friends Elivo and Lulsish, who would unfortunately never play together in the Overwatch League despite being on the same team. Russia dominated Group D with no opposition, to the point that it isn't worth talking about. But this was the debut of Team Paraguay, and Hadi for the German squad. The Netherlands would finally make some noise, taking home Group E against some more notable competition in Finland, Portugal, and Saudi Arabia. Finland would miss BlizzCon for the first time ever, as it was clear that they sorely missed their DPS duo of Taimu and Linkser, as well as Big Goose, who sat this one out. Portugal is underrated, as they had Gray, who played for the Paris Eternal as a support player, but he wanted to follow in the footsteps of Harry Hook and played DPS this time. It didn't work out though, as Saudi Arabia defeated them with KSAA leading the way. Netherlands had finally developed, bringing in new players like Dons and A10, who helped lead them to victory in this group. The USA, China, Korea, Canada, and France were automatically invited and got the top 5 seeds. This would be a pretty typical World Cup, as it was top heavy, with the usual suspects at the top. Wait, where's Korea? Korea lost? That's right, Korea lost their first match in history against Team France, and then got their backs blown out by Team USA 3-0 in only the group stage, but they were still able to punch the ticket to BlizzCon. They were by no means a weak team, but many of the top players decided to sit it out because they thought they had it in the bag. There was no Jonak, no Smurf, no Fury, no Fleta, but they still had a great team. The boys in blue just did it better, going 4-0, led by Super, who made his debut alongside Corey, who was a very good Overwatch League player in a short tenure with the Justice, before going to play Valorant. France would also qualify from Group A, going 3-1 with a fresh roster consisting of 2 new support players being Hip and FD God, who would both play for Paris at some point. Hip would leave for Valorant, where he would create a team called Hip Hip Hip. Very nice job. Benbez set out so Chubbs could take his place. Poco couldn't play due to health issues, so Tech36, who played for a talented Samsung Morningstars team, took his spot. Soon and Leaf took the DPS spots, and Leaf was a great player in his time with the legendary Team Giganti, despite not being from Finland. Team UK would collapse and go winless, with Sweden making sure that they weren't too lonely at the bottom. In Group B, Canada would go winless after some controversial roster decisions limited their roster, as XQC was their chosen tank due to his popularity over skill, despite not playing competitive Overwatch for years. He was chosen over players like Chain, whose careers would have really benefited from this selection. Chain would retire in 2020 without making the league, despite being a great talent, possibly because he wasn't able to show himself on the world stage. This isn't to blame XQC, by the way, I'm sure he had nothing to do with this. Anyway, Russia had a rather weak roster this year, and would win only 1 game against Canada. Netherlands narrowly went 2-2 after defeating Russia to guarantee themselves a spot at BlizzCon for the first time. My Danish Kings went 3-1 and also would make their first BlizzCon appearance. China went 4-0 and had a ridiculous roster this year, without Leaf, who couldn't play due to health issues, but instead with Eileen and Jinmu, who were both very flexible and dynamic players who fit perfectly together, with the Chinese team's cornerstone player Guzhui, who didn't take his foot off the gas this year, playing like his life was on the line every single game. Elsa, Yveltal, and Kyo also joined the team from the Chengdu Hunters, and Yveltal is the best player of the 3, as he had a long successful career and is a very cerebral player. Netherlands actually almost took them down, drawing them and taking a map off of them while keeping the rest of the series very close, but China still looked to be a very strong team. In the playoffs, the USA and China got a bye for finishing at the top of their groups. South Korea faced off against Denmark in a kind of close match that isn't reflected in the 3-0 score, as 2 of the maps were actually drawn. France defeated the Netherlands 3-1 in an uneventful match. France would then face off against China, where they were handily defeated 3-1 before the main event, the return of the hottest rivalry in the World Cup. Korea and the US, the world's 2 top Overwatch powerhouses facing off, a true clash of titans. The rivalry was legendary, and this was sure to be a great match. It really wasn't though, as Korea got blown out, winning 1 map and drawing another. This was a huge win for the US, who exercised the greatest playoff demon and went into the grand finals scorching hot. They defeated China 3-0, and South Korea would have to settle for 3rd place, as China took home their 2nd straight silver medal. This was a triumphant win for the USA, and showed the validity of North America in an esport for once, as Super definitely took home the MVP over that fraud. Things were looking great for Overwatch esports, as the fan favorites took it home, and things were looking great heading into the next Overwatch World Cup. Guys, I have bad news. There was no 2020 Overwatch World Cup, no 2021 Overwatch World Cup, and certainly no 2022 Overwatch World Cup. After the success of the World Cup, Overwatch League also saw an increase in attention in 2019, but afterwards saw a downturn in views and quality, totally because there was no World Cup, and definitely not because of COVID-19. Overwatch League would continue to kind of flounder and slowly decrease in attention, with less professional players coming into the game as contenders basically died, with a few teams at the top and everyone else suffering. The collegiate scene is the only one who improved this time, because the players at the top from before were now college-aged and wanted to earn a degree while still pursuing their dreams. It was mostly negative news for Overwatch, to the point that in 2023, despite Overwatch 2 recently coming out, Overwatch League was announced to be in its final season. But then, out of the ashes, the community's favorite event was announced to be making its return after 3 long years. The World Cup would have a very strange format this year. But it's okay, because maybe they forgot over the break. There would be a wild card, where teams that were barely out of range of being invited would compete to play for their region. Then they would play within their region to decide seeding for the group stage. Their group stage would decide who went to BlizzCon. First, Denmark, led by World Cup rookies Shockwave and Doge, who had already had successful Overwatch careers by this point, won their side of the bracket. Kelix, a true member of the game's old guard, yet again represented his country in this event, and he's still a great player. Portugal qualified with a decent team led by HK3, who is actually from Macau, a former Portuguese colony. Finland came out of Group B, with LH Cloudy originally a tank before some drama forced him and Saudi player Yazan to be kicked out, but I'll get into that later. But they had great players in Vestola, who had 2 separate stints for the Paris Eternal, alongside former Florida Mayhem member Sana, who was an elite Sombra. Mauga came out of retirement with this event, and he didn't lose a step. He was still able to keep up despite not playing professional Overwatch in a full year. It was clear that they felt they had something to prove after being relegated to the wildcard tournament, and played the rest of their games with a vengeance. Iceland would also qualify, led by the familiar faces of Happy Cool and Vinci. In the Americas region, 5 teams would make it to the group stage. Team Mexico would qualify for the first time, going 3-2 with only losses to Canada and the US, which is pretty good. I don't know a lot about Mexican Overwatch, and it seems like a lot of these players don't even play contenders, but good for them. Brazil would also qualify, led by Neil, who was a returning member alongside Ludwig, the streamer, who is surprisingly good at Overwatch and also Brazilian. Canada also made it in for the first time in the last 3 years without XQC, instead being led by Seeker from the Valley, and Crimzo, who was an Overwatch League veteran, and the GOAT Magic Mateball, who is funny on Twitter. Colombia went 5-0 in their group, with EQL playing for them this time, after his long Overwatch League career with Philly. I like this team's names as Happy Alonso and Super Gomez really strike fear into the heart. The USA also won, with Hydron and Sugarfree as totally the only DPS players selected to the roster and no one else. They played great, and Sugarfree is an absolute legend of the game, and is the youngest player to be signed to a contenders team, when he joined Atlanta Academy at 13 years old. Super made his return with Kaluj, and the crackhead RuPaul joined in the backline. In the Europe and Middle East regions, 5 teams would move on, but in this group, there were 16 teams. From Group A, my Danish Kings would barely miss out on qualification, going 4-3, only losing to the 3 teams that qualified, and with their chance to qualify on the line, they blew a lead to Team Spain. France qualified in 3rd place with Ben Best, Poco, and FD God making their return, along with Nico, who hadn't played professional Overwatch in a while up to this point. Spain had the best performance yet in the post-Harry Hook era, getting 2nd place, with Helv officially reclassifying to being Spanish again after a few stints with Switzerland. They also have a player named Crazy Dragon. The UK got 1st place behind Kai, losing only to Denmark, showing that we still own them, even after all these centuries. Smex made his long-awaited return, even though I was probably the only one who was waiting, as he's one of my favorite players. And Wamone and Cronus made their World Cup debuts. Group B was a bit more interesting, as Sweden would miss out on qualification, again, despite great performances from Kevster and Sparker. Norway had a great performance led by Onigod, who made his World Cup return and once again showed that he was actually good at the game, and his poor performance in the Overwatch League was a fluke. Finland played with a vengeance, and handily qualified, coming in 2nd place, losing only to the champions of the group, Saudi Arabia. They originally had Yazan, the Farah player, on DPS, and he played very well, but was removed from the World Cup due to some serious allegations. LH Cloudy was also removed for saying that Yazan was effectively a booster who used dirty tactics to get a bunch of accounts into the top 10 every season. Saudi Arabia would get 1st place, and the team was amazing this year, with Sirmajed definitely being the best player. They played great as a team though, and that set them apart from everybody else. There was a lot of drama surrounding this team as the fans were very toxic. Players are definitely responsible for this at least a little bit, as they encourage the fans to act this way, but I don't see why people take Overwatch this seriously. The toxicity is best exemplified by one of Cloudy's tweets having 1.8k likes and 1.7k comments. There was also some homophobia and racism going on, but I don't really want to get into that. I just like the game of Overwatch. Anyway, in the Asia Pacific region, in Group A, Hong Kong would get 3rd place and move on behind Mango J's performance performance once again, but with other star performances from Kurumi on DPS. Japan would have a great performance this year with a roster consisting of contenders team Viral, and they would go undefeated except their loss to the Juggernaut South Korea team, who are not playing around this year. This was the Avengers of roster. Each of these players could be considered the best at their role. Lip is the best player in the game, straight up. Sparkle has been great for years, and he was an excellent player on the Paris Eternal and won a chip with Dallas Fuel. They had at least 2 of the best 4 tank players ever in Hanbin and Fearless, with the best backline probably ever put together in Chio and Fielder, with Finn coming off the bench. This was a serious roster, and they were taking the World Cup seriously for the first time in a long time. In Group B, Team India would have a decent performance behind the GOAT Pummy on DPS, who was undeniably better than Proper, which is probably why he was too scared to play in the World Cup this year. Thailand finally had a good performance for the first time without Titawat, but with Aputo, who had been on the team since their very first World Cup. Australia won this group going undefeated. Punk once again flexed his muscles and led this team onto the group stage. These groups were very top heavy. In Group A, Finland and South Korea dominated, having a close match against each other and no one else. In Group B, Canada and the UK moved on in a pretty weak group, with the UK being the best team. In Group C, China dominated and Spain got second place, with no close matches with any other team. In Group D, the US kinda got slapped around a bit, but brought it together once they subbed Super in for Cluj, although they still lost the winners of the group, Saudi Arabia. In the playoffs at BlizzCon, South Korea faced off against Canada, China played the US, the UK played Finland, and Saudi Arabia played Spain. The event runners thought that the Korea vs Canada match was going to be a 3-0, so they budgeted less time than they needed, forcing the game to be finished off stream, where Korea still won 3-1. Good on Canada for getting their one though. China beat the piss out of the USA, though this match was actually winnable if Leave and Shai didn't deadlift their team to victory. Finland beat up on the UK with Vistola really showing off his dominance. Saudi Arabia defeated Spain 3-0 in a blowout match. In the semifinals, China was able to knock out Korea in a very, very close match that was decided by the excellent play of Monk and Gujue. In the other semifinal, Saudi Arabia was barely able to defeat Finland 3-2 in an all-time classic match that came down to the wire. Finland had one bad ult towards the end and blew a lead on the last point of the last map of the series, leading to Saudi Arabia going to their first World Cup final to face off against the veteran Team China. In the third place match, Vestola really turned on the Jets to defeat South Korea, and Masa was vindicated for coming out of retirement by getting a nice medal to return home with. In the grand final, Saudi Arabia pulled a reverse sweep against Team China in another match that came down to the wire, with the Excelsior play of Quartz and Sirmajed making the difference. Sirmajed played great in this whole World Cup and would have no doubt been the MVP if they had done that this year, although Vestola made a good case for him to win it instead. Saudi Arabia not only won the World Cup, this was their first time making it to BlizzCon in history, giving them a 100% BlizzCon win rate. The World Cup is probably the most important event in all of competitive Overwatch, with players from all around the world coming together to play for their country and talk as much trash as possible. Players like Mickey and Padapan, Gujue and Leave, Tayo and Punk all owe their careers to their great performances in the World Cup, with hopefully countless more blazing their own path in the future. It seemed like South Korea would dominate, but in the end, 3 unique countries would end up winning the 5 Doom tournaments. Yeah, Korea did dominate actually. China was the ultimate second place team, getting second 3 times and choking away their best chance to win this year. These events have a very low prize pool for the level of competition, showing how important this event is, as players will always try their hardest to compete. Competitiveness is what brings us together at the end of the day, and I'm sure that even at the end of time, we will still be competing for who can be the best. Thank you for watching this video, and if you made it this far, please subscribe. This video took me forever. To start, the desk this year had some memorable